Rooney, great to have you back in the studio. And I wanted to do our best to create a video about the history of the creation of St. Andrews and start there and work our way forward as we come up with questions. And then we invite participants and alumni for future questions for another show. Where did it all start? What was the combination? Because it was several schools that were put together to create St. Andrews.
Yes, the Presbyterians decided they had too many colleges they were trying to support, so they looked at the possibility of merging them together. I think it was a Ford. Well, anyway, one of the foundation funds funded the looking together, and they ultimately decided that if they merged Flora Macdonald, Presbyterian Junior College, and Peace was supposed to be in the original merger, the three of them. Ultimately, Peace decided they did not want to be part of the merger and withdrew from the merger. So it was left with St. Andrews, Flora Macdonald, and Presbyterian Junior College merging to form St. Andrews. It got located in Laurinburg because what they had was a competition throughout the state as to who would host the site for the new college. So different cities developed proposals for hosting the site. And in the end, it turned out that Laurinburg had the most attractive proposal. And if you look into it, you'll discover that many of the sites that were originally in making proposals for St. Andrews ultimately wound up with a college located there. Methodist came out of it, North Carolina Wesleyan. I think even something like Sandhills, the community college, the competition for the location for St. Andrews resulted in the creation of Sandhills as the state developed its community college system.
The two that fed into St. Andrews, what do you know about those two?
I'm not really well versed in the history. Flora Macdonald dates back to 1896. I think it started as Red Springs Seminary. Then it became Consolidated Presbyterian College, I believe, before it was finally renamed to be Flora Macdonald.
And was it co-ed or men's or women's?
No, it was a women's school.
Okay.
Became co-ed, I think, in the 50s. They had started accepting men as day students only. In doing it, there was never a men's dormitory on the Flora Macdonald campus. Presbyterian Junior College was a men's school, and I'm not sure the forerunners of it. Carolina something or other was the first name, and I think the original campus for a while was a Methodist school, if I recall correctly, before it became Presbyterian Junior College. And the glider base in Laurinburg for World War II was a big plus for the PJC because they did a lot of stuff related to pilot training and so forth, which helped expand their student body.
And if someone happens to know more, chime in or add to it so we can build that out, because we've had at our reunions, I believe, students from both that I met, which is exciting to see, are them all coming together. And then they picked St. Andrews. And what do you know about it? There's some early photos that show the building of it. And basically what we know as the lake was man-made.
Yes. The campus was an architectural design. Odell and Charlotte was responsible for the overall design of the campus, the buildings, the shaping of the campus, how it would be situated on the site in Laurinburg. And the site in Laurinburg, I think, was originally 830 acres. For those of you who were there in the early days, you might recall that basically the campus extended down to just about where the armory sits. I believe the bypass that runs around Laurinburg actually ran on what was campus property when the grant was made to the school. So it was a big bit. Most of it was farmland. The lake was made forming a dam, and they decided on how they wanted the lake shaped. The causewalk going across the center, dividing the academic with the student life side of campus. Where the bell tower was situated was referred to by most of the students in the early days as Chapel Island. The plan was to build a chapel on that peninsula. It probably had to have been enlarged. If you start looking at history, you'll find in the late 60s, the Belk Foundation gave, I believe, $250,000 for the building of a chapel on campus. Well, it turned out the campus was dreaming at the time, and the gift resulted in a planning session for the chapel, which resulted in a three-story building, multi-purpose sanctuary, office for the college pastor, the assistant pastor, etc., and an architectural estimate of $1.2 million. Needless to say, we did not have the funds to explore that. And if you see where the role of religion in the college has gone over the years, then you wonder why you would have needed something that. Now, you go back and look at the days. In those days, the students had required chapel meetings. As a freshman, you had to meet chapel once a week. And if you failed to meet those chapel meetings, you got docked quality points. In other words, it didn't have major impact, but if you were one of those students who was chewing your fingernails over the GPA, losing a few quality points could put you on the negative side instead of the plus side. So it did have some impact on the grades. So that got everybody to chapel. But by the time we got into the 70s, the required chapel had been dropped. If you think about sizes, I don't know, most of you probably have not seen Trinity Presbyterian Church over on Blues Farm Road. The sanctuary for Trinity was built in the early 80s at a cost of about $250,000. It seats, I think, 140 people, 160, somewhere in that neighborhood, when would have easily served what we would have needed for a school chapel now. So it's sort of how times have changed and what goes on. The bell tower got put on the Chapel Island in the mid-70s by Dr. Perkinson, or Bun Perkinson, the president at that time. It was done to satisfy the commitment to the Belk Foundation. They put up the bell tower, named it the Belk Bell Tower in lieu of a chapel. And at the same time they did that, they renovated the Student Union and named it the William Henry Belk College Union. And I'd love to know the story, why the choice of that name. As a photographer, I've always liked taking the pictures of the students on the steps, because above the steps is the name, William Henry Belk College Union. Where do you think you would find the William Henry Belk College Union? Most people would say it would be on the Belk College campus.
Right.
I think the dream was that the Belk Foundation would like that in the family, that they would then come through with a major contribution that would fund future development of college and result in changing the school name to Belk College. Needless to say, it never happened.
In the beginning, not all the buildings were there. What do you remember as the first core buildings?
The initial building phase had the Student Union. It had the four, what we refer to as women's dorms, Wilmington, Concord, Granville, and Albemarle. On the men's side of campus, we had Orange and Mecklenburg. I think roughly 2 years later, they built Winston-Salem. In 1964, when I set foot on campus as a student, they were completing the construction of Kings Mountain, which is now Pate Hall. At that time, when we moved in, there was only one functioning bathroom in Kings Mountain. So everybody was running to Winston-Salem or Mecklenburg It lasted about a month till we got it on. During Perkinson's year on campus, they decided they were going to change the Kings Mountain to a conference center, at which point they did some renovation on it and renamed it at that point.
So which dorm were you in?
Winston-Salem was my dormitory.
Okay.
Part of the time on the second floor, part of the time on the third floor.
I see.
In those days, each dorm had a house mother. Usually a widow was looking after things. In a couple of cases, we had a faculty member who was looking after the dorm. You had weekly room inspections to keep things in order. And they were known to go through the suites on a daily basis to check the conditions. We had vending machines, which had bottles in. So one of the functions was to carry those bottles down to the vending machine as you filled up the crates you had up in the suites. Each suite had a suite leader, normally an upperclassman, usually a senior, who was looking after the members in the suite. And in a 3-story dorm, the typical suite leader's room in those times was the large room at the end that has all the glass windows. Those were the suite leader rooms. They were a little more random choice when you got to the flat dorms, but in the big ones, rarely did a suite leader choose something other than the end room. Now, you had most space in the end room, but the other thing you found if you talk to those suite leaders, the end room tends to be the coldest room in the dorm because you have all of that glass on one wall exposed to the outside. So that was one reason to consider possibly choosing a different location.
I started in one room in the suite, and then I don't know that was a suite leader, but I'm not sure. But I do know we had a kind of a dorm president, and I got voted that for a while on Mecklenburg, and I ultimately got in one of the end ones, and I used drapes and a bookshelf around there to create some shielding for the cold that had happened. It was at the end of Mecklenburg facing the soccer field. Now, was the soccer field there in the beginning as well that you remember?
Yeah, soccer field. Well, actually, the soccer field, I think, originally was in the middle of the track.
I see.
And they didn't like the relationship of the sun to the soccer field. So they moved the soccer field out of the track and over to its current location. One of the things they did not fix that you may recall is the corner near Mecklenburg is actually a little bit lower than the rest of the field. It's not quite flat. They never got around to fixing that problem on doing it. If you turn back to the track, when the school opened, there was no gym. The track was a synthetic track, which was highly unusual for a school at that point. And one of the things the school liked to claim was we had the best outdoor athletic facilities of any small college in the South. Scotland High used to come over and run their track meets on the grass tech surface. Unfortunately, over time, maintenance got the best of it. In the late 70s, in order to make the track look pretty, they decided to cover it with asphalt rather than to redo the grass tech surface. While the asphalt made the track look very good, our runners quickly found out that you really didn't want to run long events on the track because you ran into the problem of shin splints.
Right.
So that sort of did away with the utility of the track at that time. We also, at that time, had a goalpost out there and a football field for intramurals and so forth. If you were here in the 90s, we were running football camps in the late summer. At that time, the regulations was such in South Carolina, if you wanted to practice as a team, you had to take the team out of state to start an early practice season. Laurinburg sits right across the line, which made it convenient. Somehow we got the Summerville team out of South Carolina to hold their camps up here. And at that time, Summerville was a football power in South Carolina, and that led to lots of other teams coming up here to practice. And we would have, 10, 15 football teams around, I think, at the peak. They were practicing downtown on Legion Field and all over the place. Everywhere you looked, we filled up all the dorms with football players. Now you couldn't do that because the regulations have changed, that they can have the early practices. The schools are running their own football camps and so forth. So that took us out of that market.
Early buildings on the academic side. So now we've got the basic ones. And on the academic side, what were the first buildings that started going up there?
Academic, you had two. Vardell, the conservatory, music, and the liberal arts building were the two initial buildings put up. The library was downstairs where, well, if you were in the past 20 years, was the art department. That housed the library, and when the library was built, they moved into it in, I think, the fall of 1963. The business office took up residence in that space.
Really?
At the bottom of the building. Yep. They were down there, was your business office, and 3 classrooms in doing it. And after the building of the library, nothing happened until we got to building the science building, which we moved into in January of 1970.
Well, that was spectacular too, because that was something that I just remember. I went there, I think 78, but I think they claimed like a quarter of a football field or something, the size of the science building, but it was quite an anchor of attracting pre-med and other people to the school.
Yeah, the science building, one of the motivations behind building the science building was because of the merger of Flora, Macdonald, and PJC. Flora Macdonald was larger than PJC, so we initially had a lot more women and men. If you recall, when we moved in campus, we had 4 women's dorms, plus half of Orange, the co-ed dorm, was women. So that left in the initial phase Mecklenburg and the other half of Orange. So it was that far out of balance. Now, with the addition of Winston-Salem and Kings Mountain, the balance got closer, but it still favored the women by, I think, about 65%. The development of science on the campus was viewed as a way to be attractive to having more men on campus. So that was one of the goals behind the science department's development, was to attract more men to campus. Now, one of the things that's really weird, if you're here now in 2025, the balance is now shifted. We have way more men than we have women, primarily because of football. And in science, probably 80% of our science students are women. And it's been the equestrian program that's been attracting the women. So the pendulum has swung from one side to the other in doing it. Now, if you go back to the early days, the large lab we have, the one single lab, was a, you might say, design prototype. G. Tyler Miller was behind the design. It was not done haphazardly. He got a lot of funding from different grant agencies. They had numerous meetings or multiple meetings talking about what the ideal design for the lab would be. And that was how it came about. One of the purposes behind the design was to try to make science more economical. So we built a lab that had a single stock room, and therefore we did not have the duplicates. Science primarily has grown up as a program where you have your own little cubbyhole and empire. So you've got the biology beaker, the biology balance, the chemistry beaker, the chemistry balance, the physics beaker, the physics balance, each squirreled away in individual areas. Here we're using the same beaker for everything. We have one instrument center which supported all of the courses, not a separate set of instruments for each course. And all of those things contributed to making it economical. Some of the grants helped us in the original equipment, but when we moved into the building, it was a real showplace. It was the envy of any small college in the U.S. in the way the building was equipped. NSF, which was involved in it, we were on their visitors list. We had in the first 5 years probably over 500 visitors from virtually anywhere in the world you want to name. I remember one group from New Zealand, some from Great Britain. They were coming from all over the place to look at it. Anybody building a science building, the recommendation was take a look at the design that St. Andrews has, see whether you'd like to incorporate some of those things into it.
Wow. And then it was the pioneer of being accessible too. That's what I remember, because when I went there, one of the things that was exciting is there were so many people available in wheelchairs, and there was an entire facility for students that need more medical help to have. And I believe it was one of the first, at least on the East Coast, if not the country, to be so accessible.
I think that's the case. I don't know too much about the handicapped history in relationship to other schools at that time. When the campus was built, it was designed with ramps to get you to anywhere you want it, with the exception of the third floor of a three-story, or second and third floors of the high dorms. But you had ramps leading into the flat dorms, ramps leading into the student union. The electric doors came later. I think probably at the time we opened campus, electric doors were virtually unknown or a real novelty. I remember my hometown of Virginia, we had a drugstore that had an electric door, and it was so unusual. It was an advertising item in their commercials about the electric door, or the newspaper ads talked about the electric door. I can't think of the phrase they used for describing it. Over time, we expanded with the electric doors. There were additional ramps added. In the late 80s, we moved to the construction of Burroughs Center, which featured full-time nursing support. And at that point, the handicapped students moved to part of them being quadriplegics rather than paraplegics in the handicapped group. And at the height of the handicapped operation, I suspect we had 50 students, over 40 in wheelchairs. Probably with all the handicapped students, well over 50 there on campus. The handicapped era came to an end, I think about 2003, somewhere in that neighborhood. And I don't know the real stories behind the why. Apparently the story is that, funding natures had changed. One of the things that made the handicapped operation feasible was the large amount of support being provided by the federal government. The students paid normal tuition, but the services required for the extra support were pretty much funded by the federal government at that time. Internally, we had run Burroughs as an operation that was part of St. Andrews. The person operating Burroughs, Roger Decker was the first person, Burroughs, and the guy behind its building. And before that, he had what was called his Freedom Village. It was a group of about 8, I think it was 6 house trailers, maybe 4, set up in the woods behind Granville. And those house trailers were adapted for handicapped living. They had ramps leading into them. The showers were modified to be roll-in showers. The cooking surfaces were lowered to wheelchair height, etc. So that was all made available. We had a fire over in Granville. I'm not sure what year that happened, but when we had the fire in Granville, it burnt down essentially one wing, and the choice was made in remodeling Granville that they would take that wing and create, I think we wound up with 6 adaptive living units there. And when they built those adaptive living units, they shut down the Freedom Village trailers and they were moved off campus. And this was at the same time we had Burris going on. I'm not sure how many students were originally over there. Each room was an extra large room for 2 handicapped students. I don't know whether it was 6, 8, probably, I don't know. It's been a long time looking building, but there was also at least one adaptive living suite as part of the Burris Center. So students could learn how to live on their own when they got off campus. Was the whole purpose of the adaptive living suites. And we also had driver education at that time. We had a car modified, and we also had a handicapped van, wheelchair lifts and hand controls and all of that, and taught the students how to drive.
I just remember it was such a rich experience for me because I got to build relationships with people who I hadn't been around as much before. And Bobby McCarter, I think it was his name, he was a quadriplegic that became the dorm president. Now, I have to tell you something funny with that. Bobby was, I guess, a training to be an Olympic athlete and had a tragic accident, became a quadriplegic. I used to like to hang out with him. I'd go over to his place, and this was in the medical facility. And I said, Bobby, I really like talking to you, but also you seem to attract some of the most attractive women. And Bobby, who had such a great sense of humor, he says, that's why I'm here too. and it was really excellent because it just taught me this normalization. Now, we all have projections or automatic behaviors, and mine was kind of putting people that had less capabilities on a pedestal. And I learned of the obvious thing that people who might be in a chair or have some other challenges, some were good and some were not as likable, and that was a great lesson for me, Rooney, because that was like a normalization. And the truth is, what I've learned over the years is we all just want to be treated like an individual. And that's one of the wonderful lessons I got. And I became friends with a guy named Larry. I don't always remember him, but he had, I think, cerebral palsy from birth. He had a handmade crutch he used and walked. And we just became the best friends over that. And then I met my best friend, Rick Rossi, there, and many other good friends that are still connected now. But I remember Larry even moved to Raleigh. He moved to Raleigh. He had just enough money, and he lived in the YMCA in downtown Raleigh. And we kind of would get together and debate politics and stuff. But those friendships really built on. So that was such a blessed time for me to be there and learn so much. I think another thing that probably had it fade away is just the fact that it was almost required for all schools. So everyone else was getting on board with accessibility too. That I'm sure that had an impact.
I'm sure that's an impact, but you've got to think about, I think you'd be still hard pressed to find any school which would offer the level of support that Burris offered to the students.
Oh, it's incredible.
The electric doors and that type of thing was there, but when you got to that 24-hour nursing support in doing it,
it was wonderful.
I don't think it's there in the other schools.
No, and they set it up so that it had to feel like a dorm room.
Yeah.
And it was so wonderful because Bobby had like a dorm room, but people had to come in and help him eat, feed, and everything else. So, and that was, I remember that kind of next to the gym and the swimming pool. So when did that come in?
Well, In the fall of 1967, the gym opened. And the gym configuration of those days is not the same as it is when we closed.
Right.
When the gym opened, we had, well, if you walked in where the night stands, to the right side was what was called the Knights Room. And the Knights Room had 6 bowling lanes in. It had 4 pool tables and 4 ping pong tables. It was essentially the campus recreation center. You had a small gym in the back. For those in current years, you think of more so being the wrestling place. The wrestlers had taken it over pretty heavily. The swimming pool was there, but next to the swimming pool were handball courts. That's now the football locker room. If you got to the other side of the gym, you had, well, there was no training room as you think of currently. They had a visiting team room and what was the training room. And that training room now has gotten moved over, taken over the Knights room and the weight room. The weight room was originally over on the corner towards where Burris is. And it was probably 30 feet square or something like that. It was used as a Hall of Fame room at one time. And the football coaches wound up in it. And at that point, next to that was a room which was the wrestling room. It was essentially the right size. You could put a wrestling mat on the floor in it. And if you've been in the Hall of Fame room or the football coaches room, the flooring in there, at least originally, is in-grain wood. And the reason it was in-grain wood was to withstand dropping those weights on it without splitting the wood. So it was done in an in-grain fashion. So that's sort of the highlights of the
Yeah, I love that swimming pool. I would go there and I'd swim about a mile a day if I could. And it was tremendous for my sort of ADD personality to get exercise and get out.
Well, one note about the swimming pool, between the early days and now, the original swimming pool had a 3-meter diving board and 2 1-meter springboards, as well as a lifeguard chair, which was mounted on a big concrete post. Apparently, the insurance companies did us in, and not only did they remove the diving boards, they also cut down the lifeguard chair.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they wound up ultimately building one out of wood and setting beside the swimming pool. Now, why they removed the lifeguard chair, I don't know, but it was done.
The whole idea of the night, where do you think that came from? Because that's kind of cornerstone to the school, the Knights.
I do not know anything about how the name the Knights was selected for the athletic teams. But obviously, Knights play a big role in British history.
Right.
And Scotland being there, I would assume that's led to the choice of the Knights, but I don't know. The statues of the Knights, we've had 2 of those. The family of Rufus Hackney commissioned some of the art students and the art professor at that time to build a metal knight, which was originally put together and set underneath the cover in front of the building. You know, it had a large sword in its early days. I'll try to put a picture out on the gathering place one day of the original knight. Eventually, the students broke the large sword off and it disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to it. Somebody went out and made up a little bitty sword about like this in length with a 6-inch cross member and welded on the metal rebar as his new sword, which we never got fixed. I talked sometimes to some of the art people about building a new sword, but before that ever got done, we had the donation from Belk for the knight that's now mounted out in front of the gym. And where the Hackney knight disappeared to, I have no idea.
It's missing. Maybe someone will know and be able to add to it. But the Knights were a big part of it. And then there was an area called Farrago. Is that was a big area for where a covered area for bands and get-togethers. It didn't survive the test of time, but that in my time period, that was kind of a big deal.
Well, the social life of campus has swung like a pendulum, I guess, over the years. The very early days of the campus, the social life was built around the dorms. Each of the dorms would have a major fall event and a major spring event. Orange had one they called Orange Grove. It's the only one that comes to mind at the moment, but it was the dorms putting on the social activities. If we had something really big, well, usually we wound up utilizing the cafeteria. And at that time, the cafeteria was being operated by St. Andrews. Occasionally, we might use the Belk Main Lounge. And in those early days, Belk Main Lounge did not have a door. It was simply an open area in doing it. We got into the 70s, and at that time, the pendulum began to swing. This probably is not going to be in a logical order. Farrago, the building at Farrago, was originally built as the PE building, a temporary PE building, a place for the coaches to have offices and for the classes to go if it was raining. Normally, you had all your PE classes outside. So that was in use that way up until the gym was made. When the gym was built, Farrago became an empty building, or the tin can, as the students referred to it in the early days. Now, when we got into the 70s, the food service changed to being contracted out rather than the school operating it. And with the contracting out food service, they began to spread out in the cafeteria and restricted access to it after hours, or made after hour access more difficult. And you may not believe it, but in those original days, all of the food service was done in the square area at the end of the bottom of the steps. You know, if you walk down to the bottom of the steps, there was a set of glass doors to the right. Which are not used in current times. That was the door you went in to get your food.
In Belk.
Yeah, in Belk. When you got through that line, you had everything, dessert, drink, so forth. There were two lines running through there, and it came out the door, which normally now is used as an entrance in the square side of it. You did not have vending machines and so forth out in the large part of the cafeteria, or a huge salad bar that sits out there now. So those things began to restrict access. So that became a push towards looking for another location. I don't know what the current regulations are, but we also, in that general era, began to run into a bit. The local fire marshal decided that we needed more exits than the dorm provided to use the dorm for a party. Now, I personally could never make any sense out of it. The 3-story dorms, there's a problem. You got 2 exits off of the main lounge. But you get to a flat dorm, well, guess what?
Every corner.
You got 4 exits plus the main lounge. So there was lots of ways of getting out in a hurry. But anyway, you know, now you needed someplace to go. You couldn't go back to the cafeteria because food service really didn't want you in there in doing it. So Farrago became the target of the place to go. Now, I think probably prior to getting it there, I don't know. At one time, Farrago was the art department. The art department decided they wanted to be over there, and they were using it for a while. Just when in the time frames, I don't know. But when Farrago became the party center, initially it had no food service. Well, I believe it was Craig Hannes who was the dean of students at that time. he decided that what he was going to do was close the snack bar over in the student union and pick it up and move it over to Farrago so they had food service.
Right.
Well, it sounds like a great idea and probably is good for the night you got a party in.
Right.
But if you're got the rest of the time, do you want to walk from Concord or Wilmington back in the woods to get to your snack? That's always been one of the problems with the snack bar in general, is not being able to generate enough traffic to really support it. If you go back to the student union, when the student union opened, the snack bar was in the large room next to the lake. And the bookstore is right inside the door, which basically is sort of the configuration you have now. But in the early 70s, late 60s, they decided they really want to make a proper bookstore. And they decided to move the bookstore over to where the snack bar was and move the snack bar to where the bookstore was.
Yeah, that's what my time period was.
And in doing that, they created what they called the Red Line. It was modeled after a British pub. Art Macdonald, on one of his trips to England, actually bought some English antiques to furnish it with, and it was set up with big, heavy curtains, simulated wooden beams, tabletops, which had a finish that looked like they were stone, but it never really generated a huge volume of traffic. It was very attractive. There's no question about that. And that was what was tore down to move over to create Farrago. Farrago, for small groups, is a very nice facility, or was in the early days. But when you start dealing with the whole campus, you've suddenly got a building that really can't accommodate that many, particularly when you take out 25% of the floor for food service and another 25% of the floor for the band. There isn't much left over for the rest of the people in doing it. So that's sort of the general history of that.
Yeah. And then next to it was the radio station, WSAP. Is that right?
WSAP started out in the storage room off of Orange, right off the main lounge. And then when the PE moved out of the tin can, the radio station took over what was the office area there.
And then moved into a little building.
And then they moved next door into the house. And the house originally, when it opened, was the campus infirmary. And it was actually made up of two houses pushed together initially to create the infirmary. So the radio station was in there. I guess it was the probably late 80s, early 90s. I don't know. Time runs together.
It was huge. I mean, now it was cable direct, so you had to actually hook up when I was there to the cable. But we had some of the students had convinced the main record companies that I think we were bigger than we were, because we would always get the latest records coming in. And it was we had carts that would go in. We had commercials that were running. I got to be the, quote, engineer of the station for a while, which just making sure reconnecting wires or getting carts together to be I guess they would stretch out and replaced. And so it was like a mini real radio station.
Well, the heyday of the radio station was probably when they were still in Orange. It had gotten going big guns. In fact, one of the claims, the radio station, they were the only club on campus that generated an income.
I see.
Because they were selling commercials downtown and so forth. And they would take advantage of that to have some big promotions each year. They had one year they were getting in promotions. They were talking about, well, we're going to give this if you bring in this, and if you bring in that, we'll give you, so many record albums, or whatever they had to give away. And one of the things one night, the guy said, well, if you bring in a cannon, we'll give you this. Well, the VFW post down on Atkinson Street has two small artillery pieces.
Right.
So the students set off to get one. And the story goes that they had gotten back to Haney's towing it with their car before the police asked them what was going on. Since then, the cannons, I think, have been embedded in concrete, so they can't be moved again. But it got the students going on some big-time stuff. So, and in those days, we had one of the DJs set a record for the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest continuous broadcast in doing it. So that was sort of the heyday in it. The original system was what they called carrier current. It had a cable running between each dorm, and that was the signal in doing it. And with a carrier current system, you could essentially set your radio anywhere you want in the room. You turned it to a certain AM frequency, and you picked up the signal. And if they got their transmitter out of tune, you might pick up your telephone and get the signal on the telephone in doing it. Those cables broke down over time, and at that time they were moving to putting in cable on campus, so the radio station went to utilizing the cable, which solved the problem of the ground cables deteriorating, but it also opened up the problem that, you had to have your radio now attached to the cable, so it had to be in a certain place. And if you had your radio attached to the cable, are you really going to stop at the campus radio station or tune in everything else while you're there? So that opened up a larger market in doing it to them. The death of the radio station was probably the decision that the physical plant decided they wanted the house as their office area, and the radio station had gotten a promise from Student Life that if they abandoned the radio station, they could set up over in Pate. They would give them space there. Well, in the timing of things, the radio station packed up and moved out, but the space in Pate never materialized, so it sort of got stacked to the basement.
I see.
And that was the disappearance of the radio station. I often thought at times it would have been interesting to explore the idea of, getting into doing a TV station, not in the sense of broadcasting it, but producing programs for cable TV. At one time, we did for the drama department, Art Macdonald was behind a bit. We did a weekly cable show on the arts on campus and what activities they were coming up. But one show a week is not something you can really build an audience on. You need to, say, be able to populate at 7 o'clock Monday through Friday, something to look at rather than only once a week. So that never really materialized into anything. I think we did it for about 2 years before we gave up. In doing it, we had to carry the tape over to the broadcast tower back at the shopping center and load it on a deck there to do it.
Well, I know they were working to set up a podcast studio and had mics there in recent times. That was exciting to see. One thing I'm thinking of also is the town. When I was there, it was wonderful to be able to walk into town. I remember there was, I think, in the 78, 79, something around that time, there was a place called Norma's downtown. Does that ring a bell? A little inexpensive restaurant.
Yeah, Norman's got a place in history. I'm not that familiar with it, but she had quite a reputation. The old bit, the one that shows up most frequently is, you needed to keep all 4 legs of your chair on the floor. You got whopped good if you didn't.
Yes, I was
None of this leaning back on 2 legs.
Yeah, in fact, I was there when she was a hoot. It was very inexpensive, little pieces of paper and the pencils you'd use from putt-putt or something to mark what you wanted and gave it. And it maybe was $2 or $3 at the most, if not for everything. But I just remember her sneaking up and kicking the chair out from one of the students and hitting the back. while I was there. And another one I remember in my dorm, he had longer hair or something, and she says, "Have you bathed?" She was just a hoot. And then I think there was another restaurant, if someone remembers as well, further down. But the Golden Corral, I remember that was a big deal because I was like, oh, you could take a, I took a date to the Golden Corral. It was, and that was, I think, across the street. And then there was, I think, a Kmart over the time for my time period. So the town was another wonderful piece of the culture of St. Andrews. And it was so exciting to see how it kept growing over time.
The town came out to the school when you first set foot in there. There really was nothing on that side of town. The first thing that showed up there was a Ford Motor Company. They built a new building there in doing it. I think Haney's probably came after that, and the gas station there. But all that buildup on South Main Street came out toward us. And then Perkinson got into campus development, and that wound up with the housing development between St. Andrews and the city, and the shopping center was put up at that time, and property sold to the hospital. The shopping center is one that I never quite understood. The original entrance to St. Andrews came in right beside the big stone sign you see on that side of campus. Okay. When the shopping center went up, the story was that we could not have two entrances that close together.
Okay.
So we wound up having to close the St. Andrews original entrance and make the new one on, what is it, Lynchwood? The street going in leading to the hospital.
Right. Okay, I see. Right.
But at that time, you could come out and make a left turn. Later, the city decided they were going to block it, so you could not make a left turn. The only way you could turn was make a right turn, which made things extremely inconvenient. Why, with us being behind the shopping center, we could not have come up with an arrangement that kept the original entrance of the college, I don't know. Now, one story I've heard says that Perkinson's dream was that we actually close both entrances of the college and build a new single entrance to the college that would have come in where the lake house is along that area, and then split to go to both sides of the campus. That never really happened. If you look at some of the original land planning bits, the first ones they talked about having essentially open access area, a walking path to go between St. Andrews and the hospital. That never happened in doing it. Some of those original plans, if you look at, there was lots laid out across from the athletic fields where you have that wooded area, so that they were diagonals, and each one would have a small front of the lake or the swamp down there where the sycamore trees are in doing it. And there was a plot marked for the president's house over back of the physical plant in those doings. You might say they started out with lofty ideals that got trimmed back as they went along. The shopping center, you can still see some traces of it. There was essentially like a large berm built along the shopping centers to provide a more aesthetic view of the bit rather than the direct strip. And we've cut them down now, but originally there were 2 or 3 trees left in that parking lot also in doing it. And the original setup was that the school was getting a percentage from the shopping center each year. Ultimately, the school's pressures for money resulted in the St. Andrews selling off that percentage. You give us a flat rate, we'll drop the percentage, or flat number this year, and that took away that income source because of the immediate need. And I think, really, if you look at the housing developments and all of that, the potential was there, but again, the lack of funds by St. Andrews itself resulted in us basically selling the land, but we did not make the income as if we were a commercial developer putting in the streets and selling the houses. You know, the middleman wound up making more money out of it, I think, than we did doing it, though I may be wrong in how it went.
Other things with St. Andrews was the theater was a pretty big deal. They had a nice little theater, and a lot of people seemed to get active involved. Andrew Montgomery, a friend of mine, was in our dorm, and he was the custom clothing designer for the theater. So they always seemed to get a lot of significant little plays going on in my time. How did that get started?
I'm not sure exactly where the start in the theater is. The Art Macdonald era was the era that theater really prospered. We had Art Macdonald, and he had a second person, Brad Ford, who assisted in theater, and he was the staging person, building the props, setting up the stage, light design, and that type of thing. And at that time, they were putting on 4 plays a year, 2 in the fall, 2 in the spring. The plays were normally put on by the Highland Players, which was an organization of the drama people. You participated in a play because you enjoyed it. There was no course credit given for any of these actors in doing it. You may be getting course credit for participating in some of the drama classes that you're taking at the same time, but you could not sign up for credit for theater for being in the play. So you had the theater students and a lot of students outside. And while Art was there, it seemed to get better and better. In fact, one time where the president's office is now, for a period of time, that was actually a theater.
Wow.
A small theater for developing things and so on. And I guess the other novelty in that, now that I'm running off track, is that whole end of the building down there where the registrar's office is, the president's office. That was all the home economics area.
Oh, wow.
There was a home economics program when we moved in campus. Didn't last very long before it came to an end, but it was there. So back to the theater. When Art Macdonald left, there really was not a strong move to replace him with a person of, I would say, equal caliber. So theater fell on hard times and sort of went downhill. Theater came back, I guess, a couple of times. Manette, when he was there, he built theater back a while, and Richard Brett had done a very good job of bringing theater back, but it's sort of, these programs are highly dependent on the people you put in running them, how well they work, and the people can't get there also without some support from the administration. So the program boomed and bust. In the same scenario, you can look at the writers program.
Which was extraordinary with Ron Bays.
But when Ron began to move back, we did not move to truly hit the replacement off to make the program work.
But speaking of Ron and the poetry, that's another huge area. I mean, I didn't realize till I graduated that Ron was known all over the state. He had built networks at a global level and had gotten so many famous poets in. Robert Bly, that I later connected with some of his men's stuff, had come there, and many famous poets had come to the school due to Ron Bays' great work.
Bays was a very outgoing individual that worked on making those kinds of contacts and so forth. Some of the other writers we've had, are not the outgoing individual.
Sure.
I guess, well, I'm good behind the scenes making things work.
Right.
I'm not the front man going
Right.
out to shaking everybody's hands and that
Ron,
type of thing.
Ron served that purpose well.
Yeah, you need that type of individual
Yeah.
as part of your writing program,
Yeah.
particularly when you're depending on support of people coming in for your writers' forums and
Yeah.
so forth. In doing it, you've got to have that outreach arm in order to make it work. St. Andrews over the years has prided themselves on the bit of, hiring for teaching ability.
Uh-huh.
And teaching ability is extremely important. But the other side sometimes is you also need the leadership ability
Right.
to move the gang along. And sometimes I think we've swung too far on the teaching ability without the providing a leader for the teachers
Sure.
in doing it. And that has held us back at times that we just came up short in that.
Well, Ron made the Japan connection that my good friend Mike Salibi got involved in and went and taught English in Japan. And then they had, I forgot, a famous Japanese poet that he was interested in. And then later, my friend Rick Rossi followed Mike to Japan. But that was one of the many international contacts that they gave credit to Ron Bays to making it happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't think of what the Japanese poet that he was
I know.
into big
Mishima
time.
something.
And the Japanese group out of New York, it came down to do the tea ceremony every other year or so
I see.
for the students in doing it over quite a period of time.
And the publications, and in fact, thanks to you, Rick in Japan bought one of the last publication books on Amazon you mentioned in the group, and I got one as well. So we had a great publishing arm of St. Andrews.
Yeah, they supposedly, I think I went looking the other day, and there's roughly 300 books that the St. Andrews Press is involved in turning out. And that's one of the things you discover if you look at the library had talked about digitizing the press output. Well, once you look at the list, it turns out the digitized collection the library has at this point is, I think, about 35 books. So there's a huge chunk out there that hasn't been digitized.
Missing. Yeah.
Put out by the press over the years. The press now has sort of fallen on hard times too.
Yeah. Well, I have at least one of Ron Bays's books downstairs. And then something that was exciting for me was technology of computers. I got a math computer science contract major. So Roland, to me, was a bit of a personality in getting out there and leading that. Dr. Roland with I think it was the PDP-11. Does that sound like the computer? That was the DEC computer we had. And that opened up tremendous opportunities for a small school at the time to get computer science. And I love that. We had quite a few courses up to matrix multiplication or matrix of graphics and simulating operating systems. And Roland had terminals in the science building as well as the main building. Talk about what you know about that.
Oh, I don't know. The computing, I think, originally started on campus with Helen Gustafson getting some interest in it. And in the very early days of computing, you did it on what was called a teletype with paper tape. You sat down the teletype, typed in your stuff, and it generated a long paper tape with holes in. And when you read your program in, and you didn't have the computer on site, you were sending your program to Triangle University's Computation Center. So you would call them up, feed your paper tape into the teletype, which it would then read the program off to Triangle University Computation Center. And eventually they would run through or compile the program, as they referred to it, and you'd get your results back. And if you were like most of the people involved, it didn't work because, wait a minute, we put a comma where it shouldn't be, or a semicolon, or we got an extra space here that shouldn't be there. So we got to fix it and try it all over again, and so forth it went. Roland came aboard, I believe, in 1968. Roland's specialty is physics. He had a background. He was up at King College, but he had also spent some time as a professional astronomer out at Kitt Peak in Arizona. And while at King, he had a group of students. They actually built the telescope. And while most people have a observatory where the roof rotates for the telescope, to simplify things in their building, they built the scope, put it on a fixed post, and simply had the building rolled back off the telescope when they wanted to use it. I think his father was probably a machinist at one time, and Bill was into the machining of things. So he had taught the students to machine the parts and so forth to make the telescope there. We were just getting into the computing bit at St. Andrews, and I guess Bill had the background there ahead of everybody else, and he suddenly became the computer expert. And we started out with the teletypes, and then we got actually the next step was card readers.
Yep, you had a card reader.
So the programs were simply read in and sent to Triangle University Computation Center. And then the next phase was getting that PDP-11 so we could actually run the programs on campus and get the results back. And their operation was over there where Computer Services is now. That back room that you never see was where the computers sit, and the room that has these fewer computers in, or the business office business computers, it's referred to at one time, was where the card punches set, and you turned in your programs through the window there. You would turn them in, and they would run them every so often, and you'd get to pick up your results and decide what you needed to do. And in those early days when we were first moving to the science building, one of the sections in the laboratory portion of Select Topics in Modern Science was computer programming. We set up 4 punches there in the lab, but the students would come in to punch their programs out and take them over to the LA building to run the programs. But Bill put in endless hours at the computing. It used to be a joke when you came in the morning. Here was Bill going home, and the reason he was going home is because Triangle University Computation went down about 5 a.m. in the morning every day for about an hour and a half for maintenance. So he had worked the night until they had shut down. And now he was going home and come back and work the next night to get it done. And because we had limited access to materials, Bill got into utilizing a number of the students heavily in supporting his computer operation and got them into writing programs and so forth in doing it. Jim Putnam, one of the early students working with him, Putnam's claim to fame is Windows has some of his code in somewhere.
Well, I remember we created a simulated operating system written in BASIC on it, which was exciting. A whole course on operating systems. And then one of the assignments was a lease path, like the way the phone company works. And I wrote it to the specs of the data, and Roland sat down and we go, now let's try some other data. Of course it failed, and he said, go back and start again. And I'm not sure I didn't do it because there was maybe a little slack at the time or what, but he laughed and he says, all right, now make it so we can put different data in. I went back and improved it, and it was exciting. But what I remember is the terminals, you went down in the laboratory like you were going to where the offices were at the time, downstairs, which eventually got flooded out. And there was a room on the left, and some of the terminals were in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we
And,
had a computer lab down there with
and that was exciting
10
as well.
computers. Math got into heavily using computers at one time
Yep.
in teaching, and that's where the math labs started that showed up. When they were doing the math labs, if you signed up for certain math courses, you had 3 class meetings and 2 lab meetings in a week in doing it. So that kept the students busy. One of his last projects was a supercomputer. They chained together 15, 18 computers to make one.
Wow. Wow.
Using Linux to run the
Right.
programs.
Right. And it was a great time then. The horses, of course, we got to mention that. There's so many topics. We're going to have to continue where people go, is there something we didn't miss, and include that we'll capture. But I was never a horse person, but I knew that was a real important part of St. Andrews. And I can't believe I had, at least when I was there in, 1978, and then I graduated in 83. I took a little extra time than 4 years, and but I don't remember that huge area for the horses. What was back there? Where did it start? I just knew there were some people that were into horses, and there were some horses.
Well, in the early 70s, we had a student who wanted to bring her horse to campus, Lynn Simpson, and that became the first horse on campus, and it was up there near the traffic circle. There was a house up there with an old barn. And the dean of students worked out that she could use the old barn to house her horse in the field there next, keep it. And it was sort of, well, we got one. Another year, somebody wants to bring another one. And they sort of grew on campus, and then they moved over back of Farrago out in that area and built a small area. I'm not sure how many horses they had there. And then Shelby French came on scene, and she had Singing Wood Farm, and at that point, the equestrian operation moved out to Singing Wood Farms, and it was housed there until 2001, 2002. We built the Therapeutic Riding Center, and I think 3 years later, then we put up what the students now refer to as the lesson barn, and that was the birth of the equestrian center as you know it now.
It was a spectacular area. I didn't even know we had the property back there. So I guess they always had that property. Right?
No, that property was bought specifically for the equestrian.
Okay. Oh, I see.
It's one of these things, if you had the foresight to know what's going on, you could potentially had the property. There was enough property we sold off for housing development and hospital that you could put the equestrian center out there. But that was sold at that point, and there was some thought of going back of campus, but you had 2 problems. The property behind Scotia Village is a bunch of Carolina bays and so forth, which doesn't provide you good pasture land. And then the owner of the property further back was approached, I understand, to go in that direction, but the price was way too high to go that way. He seemed to feel that it was going to have potential market value later, though, it's 20 years later and there still hasn't been a push in housing in that development.
Right.
One of your problems you have back in that area, which would not have been a big problem for the horses, is you have a high voltage power line running over part of it, and you have a city sewage treatment plant way back in there. Not too many homeowners are going to be anxious to build their house next to the sewage treatment plant. Right. So anyway, that didn't happen, and we found the land down there to put it on. I think we started originally buying about half of the property, and then when we got money for the lesson barn, then we bought the other half of the property. The house area was not in the original property, though. I don't know who owned it. I know at one time one of the buildings he had the Laurinburg Airport painted on the roof.
Really?
I don't know if he ever flew any regular planes out of it, or they were all radio-controlled planes at that time.
I see. Well, there's the Laurinburg Maxton Airport that I parachuted out of. A bunch of us went out there and did parachute at one point. But your career was running the lab most of the time, right? Logistics and taking the photography job.
Basically all the time is what
Yeah.
happened. I was ready to graduate in 1968. I viewed myself as a school teacher. I had completed all the requirements for the teaching certificate and basically got the teaching certificate and had a job offer to teach in Moore County. And before I signed the contract there, Bob Pettigo, who was running the department at that time, came down the hall and said, well, you know, we need somebody to look after the lab. And that seemed to be more attractive at the time, more interesting, and actually it paid better than school teaching a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. Obviously, what I've learned over the years, school teaching would be paying a whole lot better now.
right.
St. Andrews did, but that was what got me into it. You know, at that time, when the offer came, plans were well underway for building the new science building and so forth. So we were going to be moving into the new facility shortly. And one of my big problems initially was, how do we pack up the science lab to move?
Right.
And one of the big problems became we did need to pack it up because we needed to clear the rooms we were using essentially 6 months before we could move into the science building. So we had taken one room and boxed everything up and piled it up in one big mountain in doing it to move over to the building because we were that 6 months late getting into it. You know, the goal was to start at the beginning of the term rather than the middle of the term. We wound up getting in at the middle of the term, and it's been looking after the world of logistics ever since. When I got into the science side, one of the things came with it was 2 dark rooms we were looking at in the LA building, and I had some interest in photography, and then thought, well, maybe I might learn how to use these dark rooms, and went out and bought me a good 35 millimeter camera, and some of the students that were doing yearbook work taught me some of the basics of how to get a roll of film wrapped around a reel to develop, and things like that, and then got off on it. And so I told the guy in Virginia where I bought the camera, that was probably the most expensive investment I've ever made because I have sunk a fortune in photography equipment in the past 50 years.
Yes, but we have a lot of wonderful photos because of that, too. So.
In 1985, they were looking for somebody to take pictures, and they came to me and wanted about potentially being a school photographer, and at that point I got the title of school photographer running around taking the pictures. Prior to that, I had done for a number of years shooting all the plays for Art Macdonald. In doing it, we typically shoot a couple of rolls of black and white film and at least one roll of color slide film of the plays. And I don't know where all of those went. I know at one time, you know, they had books of them that had the photos from each play and so forth. And
maybe someone will come forward when they see this. Let us know.
Whether they're still there or not, I don't know. It's like some of the early pictures of school. What happens with those things? Somebody wants a picture. Well, when you're dealing with slides, you know, you've got the one image. You don't have a duplicate. So the people come through, they pick out the one they like. Well, it never gets returned. The next person, well, they got to pick out next best. And your collection keeps getting a little worse and a little smaller as more and more pictures disappear, as good intentions fail. In the woodworking shop in the science building, we equipped it originally with a full set of hand tools and portable hand tools, the mechanical hand tools. And you know, after a number of years, a lot of the tools disappeared, even though supposedly only faculty had access to this room. The tools kept disappearing in doing it. I think the answer was, well, they got borrowed, but they just never quite remembered to bring them back. There was a story about tote trays in the lab that I was fussing one day about missing toe trays. One of the students said, "Well, if you go out and look under this faculty member's house, I think you'll find a couple of them sitting out there full of oil." They were using it to change the oil in their car.
That's funny, and they didn't get rid of them either. That's great. And you, of course, along with photography, have a passion for glass, flowers, and things. You've got quite a collection.
Yeah,
of that.
I got into the art glass in 2015. I won or received the Science and Material Manager of the Year, and the award for that is a piece of Frabill glass. And that sort of got me interested in looking into the world of Frabill's glass. And over the years, I've taken advantage of eBay, picking up pieces that I've now got way too many. I think I'm up to about 30 different pieces of Frabill glass in doing it, plus a few other signed art glass pieces from other artists and doing it.
Nice collection of cameras and a love of not just nature and photography, but automobiles too.
Well, that's sort of my problem. My interest swings like a pendulum. I've never really gotten totally focused on one area. I tend to move about in my focus. We'll get one interest and we'll go at it passionately for a while, and something else will show up, and then we'll begin to lean into that area. So, yes, I've got all kinds of cameras around. I picked up cameras at yard sales and so forth. That probably, if I got them all together in one pile, I'd have well over 100 cameras sitting around. Now, most of them are not usable. I've got into collecting some of the scientific glassware. I've got collections of Mallinckrodt and Merck bottles. They had a series they did with painted on labels. And I've got, I think, about 80 of the Merck bottles and another 60 of the Mallinckrodt bottles. I don't know how many were in the original set of these painted labels, and some of the miscellaneous bottles of other kinds. I have a passion, I guess, I either like things extremely large or extremely small. So we get to the extremes. I've got, I think, like a 5-liter reagent bottle with a label painted on. I think it's out of England in doing it. But I also have in my desk drawer, a 1 milliliter beaker.
Cool.
So the pendulum swings like that. In recent years, I've got into fountain pens. So I now have over 100 pens.
Wonderful.
Laying around. Most of them are, a third of them probably are not usable and will never be repaired. The other 2/3 are probably working fountain pens. I'll put ink back in them. So that's been my problem. I just don't get focused. I've always liked cars and so forth, but they're a little more expensive.
That you at least to go to take pictures of the cars more than that.
Yeah, go take pictures of them when I get the opportunity to in doing it. And I still keep a few around. I've got too many of them I haven't gotten rid of, and like most of the car enthusiasts, the ones you get rid of, you also wish you'd have kept.
Right. Understand. Yeah. Well,
so it's a mixture in that kind of battle.
A regular Renaissance man. Well, we're going to wrap up this section by one of the greatest things I'm proud of that you made possible through the Alumni Council. And this is, I think my dream and vision is we sell so many more of these that we can have another version come out, because you certainly have a terrific breadth of capturing the photos and the history and the presence of St. Andrews. And I love this thing. Thanks for your time, Rooney. This was great.
You're welcome.
And what I ask is, want more, or you have stories to contribute? Maybe we can continue with some other people that remember the past of the wonderful St. Andrews that to me was such a sacred place to just walk around and have memories of. And I'm so grateful that I had the time with St. Andrews over the years, but now we're a collection of people that are keeping it alive. And one thing we could do next is the whole idea of the multicultural, multi-education science and philosophy training that went on there. That could be another topic, the STEMs and what was it called? the different programs they had to get students involved.
Well,
And
Christianity and culture was the
Yeah,
one
that was the
shows
first
up
one.
most of the time, and then
Right.
we had selected topics in modern science
Yeah.
For a number of years.
And then when I was there was to get us involved with poetry, science, philosophy, everything as well.
Yeah, Christianity and culture is involved into a few different variations. Sage is one of them. There's probably 3 or 4 other names in there if I went back and looked carefully.
So there are many more topics to cover now, but thanks, Rooney. This was terrific. Great to have you here again.
You're welcome.
If you think of another topic or want to contribute to it, let us know. And looking forward to hearing more stories and sharing them with other people. Have a great day. Remember to click subscribe, the bell, and check the text below for other links. Take care.